The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I will be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our community workshop series and is focused on the Equal Access Rule and LGBTQIA2S+ inclusivity. It is my privilege to introduce today's first presenter, Abby Miller. Abby?
Thanks, Chris. Can you go to the next slide? So I want to talk before we get into the meat of this about how we're approaching this whole series. We have 2 trainings planned today and then one next week, same time, same place, where we're going to dig a lot more into the Equal Access Rule. We're going to look at the LGBTQIA2S+ spectrum umbrella, but these are both going to be at the training level. And then if you go to the next slide, we have arranged the community workshop portion of these, which is going to be much more interactive, though I think you'll find all of them interactive. It's going to be much more interactive, and to really facilitate that. If folks are not muted, just take a quick look and make sure that you are muted. So to facilitate really good, engaged discussion, role playing, all sorts of work that we're going to be doing in these community workshops, we've divided them into 2 tracks. We have one that is really designed for frontline staff and supervisors to the extent that that makes sense for them. And then, but really the emphasis here is on, client-facing frontline staff. So very practice-oriented. And we're doing, putting anti-discrimination policies into practice, creating inclusive practices, navigating nuance, and creating spaces of safety. Now, these can change as we go on because we are going to ask you multiple times throughout this, what do you need to be successful in your work? And as we hear that, we will tweak community workshop content based on that. The second track is really for directors and supervisors to think about more from an organizational standpoint. So we've got the frontline practice and then organizations. So incorporating underrepresented perspectives into your programs. We have a policy academy planned. Bring your employee handbooks, bring your policies and procedures, all of that. How you do change management with staff. And then the third one is implementation of the Fair Housing Act and the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. For that, we're really trying to focus on the permanent housing providers, because often we spend our time, when we're talking about LGBTQIA, getting some feedback. When we talk about this topic, we do spend a lot of time on shelters, and we want to make sure that we have some time spent specifically on permanent housing as well. So that's our approach. We hope that you will join us for the appropriate tracks and next week's training. You can go to the next slide. So I want to briefly introduce you to our team. Rajni Shankar Brown is actually not able to be here today. They're at a congressional briefing, so they have a very good reason to not be here. They're coming to us from Racial Equity Partners, but they're also a professor of social justice education in Florida. We have Chris Andrews with us today that you'll hear from later. He has a fantastic background in all things community development, strategic planning, disaster planning, and Chris and I have actually been training on this topic for, I don't know, like 7 or 8 years. You have me, Abby Miller. I most recently, before consulting, was at HUD in the SNAPS office and had the opportunity to be one of the primary authors on the Equal Access Rule. So happy to talk about that. And then finally, we have Karen Cowell, you will hear from, and they are all things like director or program, like can get so nuts and bolts. It's lovely, and have worked as a director of programs for the COC as well as individual programs. And you will have us all throughout this series. So Now we'd like to see who we have here. If you could launch the first poll. So we're looking for folks to pick the closest description of your role in the system. Give us a relative sense of who's here.
No.
Thank you.
I'm an aide, a peer aide.
Right. How many people do we have on, Erin?
Abby, we have about 65 folks
Thank
on the
you.
call right now.
All right, I couldn't unmute myself. Yes, that is
That's okay, no worries. Okay, so we have a very good split here. A lot of frontline staff, a lot of supervisors, and a fair number of directors and administrators. This is fantastic. And I hope you all heard, something in there for you as we go. Today and next week are going to be really covering, a broad swath of information. And after that, then we'll dive into the more specific ones. Can you go to the next slide? And this is really just a prompt. I'd like to have for everybody who's on, if you can put your name, your pronouns, and the community that you're with into the chat, but also what you want to get out of this series. We really want to be responsive to what you're facing on the ground. So as we go, not everybody has to do it right this second, but as we go through, get that information into there. And while folks are doing that, if we can go to the following slide, I want to talk about our group norms. You're going to see this every time. These are the intentions that our team has in coming to you, and really hope and expect that folks will also follow these. That to maximize learning, you have to engage. You've got to get really in there. And that means sometimes, go down to number 3, you might make a mistake. It is totally okay to make a mistake. You apologize, move on, but also understand that your good intentions don't always equal somebody else's, don't always equal a positive impact on somebody else. So just holding space for that, for yourself to be able to make mistakes, but also understand that other people are impacted in ways that you didn't intend, and that's okay. As long as we're all here with respect and showing respect for each other. So speak with positive intentions, assume that other people have positive intentions, and finally, ask questions. Ask as many questions as you have so that we can all learn from each other. Chances are, if you have the question, somebody else does as well. Okay.
And Abby, if I can just interject there as well.
Please.
If you have a question that you don't want to put into the chat, we can make sure that you can email that directly to us. Kristen put her email kind of at the top of the chat. And I just want to reiterate what Abby said as we were kind of getting into this in the initial poll is, as you see topics that we're talking about today, next week, and through the month of July, if something pops out to you that you want to learn more, you want to dive into that, we are holding a lot of time and space in our workshops to quite literally workshop those issues and ideas with you. And so please kind of make sure that you're telling us, sharing with us, sharing with the group what you want to know, what you want to learn, and we want to curate our work to best meet those needs and questions that you all have.
Thank you, Chris. So we have another poll for you as we get into the content here. We just want to do some level setting. and see what types of discrimination you see or hear about the most in your community. And I would say, as we launch it, if none of these apply, put in the chat what the discrimination is that you see in your area. Understanding that these aren't going to be fully inclusive. Can you launch the poll, Erin?
Kristen, you got that? I think Kristen was doing polls. There we go.
Great, thank you. We have about 65% having participated in the poll. Again, if you're not seeing what you feel is the highest form of discrimination or the most frequent, please put it in the chat. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end this and share the results. So, I mean, maybe not surprisingly, a lot of the discrimination that you're seeing and hearing about is landlords rejecting clients with certain demographics, certain characteristics, but it is also not, it's not entirely landlords. Also seeing homeless programs applying different rules, turning people away. So we're going to talk about all of this, but it's good to know where the baseline is here. All right. And so to start the content here, we're going to go through diversity, equity, inclusion. We're going to talk about the different forms of discrimination. And before we do that, I know it's maybe poll fatigue, but we have one more. If you go to the next slide, I want to set a baseline here for how well you feel that you understand the federal and state anti-discrimination laws. I feel like we should have some Jeopardy music to play. Okay. Okay, so we are hanging out in the not very well to well category. Some very well. Whoever put extremely well, I think I might tap you as a presenter as we go forward. I'm just joking, but I think that's great. Okay, so that helps us as we go forward, particularly with Chris's section later. All right, so if you go to the next slide, I'm going to start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is something that we have talked about a lot in the last few years, and probably for some of you, not at all before that. For others, you've been pushing for it. But we want to make sure that anytime we're talking about discrimination, that we're not just talking about lack of discrimination, but we're talking about setting a standard that is much, much higher than that in a positive way, that we are going for equity, we're going for diversity and inclusion. So each of those, I think we often just say DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion, and we wrap them all together. But they are three different things. So equity is about impartiality, fairness, and equal possible outcomes for people. This is about equitable outcomes, meaning a leveling of the playing field, not assuming that it is already. Oh my, please check your mute button. And equity matters a great deal for our field. We know that homelessness is experienced disproportionately by some groups than others. We know that our Black, Brown, and Indigenous neighbors experience homelessness at higher rates. We know that our queer and trans neighbors experience homelessness at higher rates. And we know that when the intersection of being Black, Brown, and/or Indigenous and being queer and/or trans come together, that it is an even more pronounced disproportionality. So that means that our response systems have to mount an equitable response that is going to render just outcomes for those who are experiencing this disproportionate hardship. That's equity. Knowing that our systems need to achieve these more equitable outcomes is part of our work. And diversity and inclusion pave the way. They pave the path toward equity. They create space. So diversity in particular, it creates space to value all of the characteristics of the people who are involved. And recognizing the positive impact of incorporating all of those different perspectives into the approaches, our policies, our practices, our service models. That exchange of ideas and diverse perspectives makes everyone richer. Inclusion is the part of the recipe that keeps people coming back and contributing to organizations because they feel included, they feel empowered to be their whole selves and to belong, to have a feeling of belonging in the organization as themselves, not as a, code switched self. But this inclusion is also intensely, critically important for the services and for the clients and the humans who are trying to seek services, who haven't felt welcome or included or that they belong anywhere. If we don't achieve inclusion with our programs, then we will have the continued problem that we have now, which is an access issue. People will avoid programs. They will avoid them at all costs. And the fact of the matter is they don't need to change. We need to change so that we can respond better to them. Next slide. So that's the goal. Now I want to talk just a bit, and this is just education, about what each of these types of discrimination are. So race-based discrimination. It is anytime a group of people with the same or similar skin color, hair texture, certain facial features are treated unfavorably. It also means if a group experiences a certain condition more and there's discrimination against that condition, that also is included. So for instance, we know that Black Americans suffer from sickle cell anemia more than other racialized groups. So if there was a policy about sickle cell anemia, that would also be race-based discrimination, just as an example. Color discrimination can occur between persons of different races or ethnicities or within the same race or ethnicity. The courts have read color to mean pigmentation, complexion, skin shade, tone. So it occurs when a person is discriminated against based on the lightness, darkness, or other color characteristic. National origin discrimination is when someone's treated less favorably because they, or a friend, a parent, some associate of theirs comes from a different place, has a different accent, appears to have a particular ethnic background because of a last name, a first name, physical characteristics. Next slide. So we know that there is rampant racial discrimination prior to people coming into the homeless system. And we know this because Black Americans are three times more likely to experience homelessness than others. Native Americans are 4 times more likely to experience homelessness. Pacific Islanders are 9 times more likely to experience homelessness. Hispanics are overrepresented in homelessness. And this is just race. It's not even getting into the intersections of gender, of sexual orientation, transgender status. So there are major impacts of this discrimination that we see every day. If you go to the next slide. So religious-based discrimination. This is when somebody is treated unfavorably because of his or her religious beliefs. This law does not only protect people who belong to traditional organized religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but also others who have sincerely held, it's an important one, sincerely held religious, ethical, or moral beliefs. It can also involve, religious discrimination can also involve treating someone differently because that person's married to, or again, associated with an individual of a particular religion. Go to the next slide. Familial status. So this one's often a little misunderstood. So familial status discrimination is really about children. It's about minor children in the home. So familial status discrimination is when families with minor children, people who are pregnant, somebody who's in the process of getting legal custody for a minor child, and people with written permission of the parent or legal guardian. All of those situations, if somebody's discriminated against because of those conditions, that would fall under familial status. So this looks like refusing to rent to families with children. I think we see this a lot. Evicting families once a child joins the family, whether, if they're separated from the family, CPS involvement, or if there's a birth. Requiring families with children to live in certain areas in the building, imposing extra rules for kids, like they can't use the pools, they can't be in the common areas. And then advertising that clearly prohibits children are all examples of familial status discrimination. So if you go to the next slide, can really bring this together under this concept of intersectionality. This has gotten much more mainstream, I think, in recent years. And I want to explain a little bit about what intersectionality is, because we're definitely going to talk about it and fall back on this concept quite a bit. It is a lens through which you can see where power is colliding, where it intersects. It's not just race, it's not just gender or class or an LGBTQ problem. And when things are viewed through just a single lens, then something can look very different and a lot of people get left out. So I think a really good example is the feminist movement in the 60s, when there were women of all races working toward women's rights. But the lesbian identified women got left out. The Black women got left out, and certainly Black lesbians got left out. And that is a good example of how the intersections of these things come together. And when only a single lens is applied to something, you don't see the impact unless you are one of those most impacted, which is why you always want to have those most impacted being part of the solution making and the problem statements that you're creating. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen to talk specifically about gender and sexual orientation.
Great, thanks, Abby. Good morning, everyone. We're actually going to start off this section with a fun, I think, little video about gender identity. So Aaron, if you could roll the video, we'll start with that.
All right, folks, here we go. A romaine and kale salad with avocado, cucumber, shishito peppers, and 4 kinds of cheese. Sprinkled in balsamic straight from Italy.
Wow! In my day, salads only had 2 ingredients. A rock-hard wedge of iceberg lettuce and a stinky old dried-up tomato.
Sorry, guys. I'm gonna have to eat fast. Alex is stopping by in a few minutes to work on our robotics project.
Alex, is that the girl with that weird dog? Or the boy with the hat with the wings that flap?
No, Uncle Jay. This is Alex.
Oh, okay, I remember. A very nice young... Come to think of it, well, is Alex a boy or a girl?
Actually, Alex doesn't define themselves as boy or girl.
What else is there?
Back in your day, most people understood the world in terms of just boys and girls. But now, we know gender is more complex than that.
Wait, aren't we just talking about whether you're born with a or a hee?
When you're born, your sex is assigned in a medical way, but the sex listed on your birth certificate may not necessarily match your gender identity.
Gender identity is a person's inner experience of who they are in terms of gender, their deep personal sense of being male, female, a blend of both, or neither.
And while many people have a gender identity that's the same as their assigned birth sex of female or male, that's not always the case, because gender exists on a spectrum. Like transgender, which means a person whose gender identity is not consistent with their assigned birth sex. Non-binary, which means a person whose identity doesn't fall in the category of either male or female. And genderqueer or gender fluid, which means a person who does not identify themselves as having a specific gender at all.
Does gender identity have to do with being straight or gay?
Actually, no. Gender identity has to do with the way you feel about yourself, while sexual orientation is based on the way you feel toward others, the people you may or may not be attracted to.
You know, I really like Alex, and I can tell they're a good friend to you, but I'm still pretty confused about all of this.
That's okay. You don't have to fully understand someone to respect them. To start, try not to make any assumptions about a person's gender, and use the name and pronouns that they ask you to. Above all, be a friend or ally for people of all gender identities.
That's right, Mom. Oh, Alex is here. Come on in.
Hey, everyone.
Oh, hey, Alex. Care for some salad? The balsamic's right from Italy, you know.
Okay. So, as the video stated, gender identity is how a person feels on the inside related to gender, and this may not be the same as their sex assigned at birth. Gender identity is not a binary construct, it's fluid. So gender identity and sexual orientation are not the same. So sexual orientation is who you like and who you're attracted to. We included this graphic from the Trevor Project on the left, which is one that I like. I think it really reflects that many aspects of our lives are not binary. Like, for example, how we express ourselves. These things are fluid, and for many people, they change over time. We really live in a fluid, especially a gender fluid world now, and so that's something to really keep in mind when you're thinking of how you're interacting with folks and how you're trying to be respectful to them. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold today. So Erin, can you go on to the next slide? So a little bit of we want to talk about what discrimination looks like in some of these areas. So, I'm not going to read all of these, but I just want to point out a few. And I think especially a few that we think that the intersectionality is really important. So, with gender identity, a single father is told that shelters that take children don't accept men. So, right, this can be under a form of gender identity discrimination, but it's also a form of familial discrimination too, right? So that intersectionality really exists there. The next two is really being respectful of people, and, their personal information, making reference to a surgery for someone who's transgender is a form of discrimination. The third one, like ignoring what people's self-reported gender is, it would be, just as bad as ignoring what someone states that their preferred name is, right? And so we need to make sure we're acknowledging those things. The staff person refuses to enroll someone because they would make other participants uncomfortable or feel unsafe. I think this one we could highlight this as really under any form of discrimination, but I think really this can really be compounded based on if someone is, about gender identity and race, or gender identity and religion. So looking at someone and assuming that they're going to make other people uncomfortable. Going over to the sexual orientation side, not accepting a same-sex couple into shelter or housing. Again, this intersection isn't just about sexual orientation, it's also about how we define a family, right? We're assuming that family is, they're not a family because they don't have children. So that's something to think about too when we are thinking about how we might be discriminating against people. Not addressing complaints from folks is a really, especially based on their sexual orientation, is really a clear form of discrimination. Requiring different procedures or forcing individuals to take a different placement. We have this one listed under sexual orientation, but we also see this, as an intersection with race. Like sometimes we house folks in a certain area because we think that, they'll be more comfortable there, whether we listen to them or not. And then again, disclosure. So disclosure is a big part of the discrimination piece. We want to talk on, so sorry. So why this matters. So we wanted to put some data behind this too. So, and I think for me, every time I look at these data points, they really tug at my heart, and they really reflect the extent of discrimination for people who are transgender. These are data points actually from the state of California, which is equal to or slightly better on some of these than what we see nationally from this report. So we see that 22% of folks who are transgender have experienced some form of housing discrimination in the past year. So that could be exited from their home, denying an apartment, and things like that. This stat always shocked me. 30% of people who are transgender have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. 11% experienced homelessness in the past year because of being transgender. And another one that I think we're going back to, are we creating projects that are welcoming and people want to go there? 24% of respondents who experienced homelessness said that they avoided staying in a shelter because they fear they'd be mistreated as a transgender person. And we know that sometimes being doubled up is not necessarily a safer option than going to the shelter. So the question back of, are we creating spaces where people want to come to and want to be if they're experiencing homelessness? Could you go on to the next one, Erin? So moving on to disability, this is our last category of discrimination. So what we have on here is really the federal definition of a person with disability, but I think I want to talk a little bit about some of it's federal words, but what are some of the meanings behind those words? So when we're thinking about a physical or mental impairment, what does that mean? So this can mean impairments related to vision, speech, hearing, orthopedic things orthopedic things. This could be specific physical diseases too, like muscular dystrophy or cancer or HIV. They also include developmental disabilities, mental illness, addiction, things like that. I think one thing when we're in the top left graphic says not every disability is visible. So when we're doing our work and we're trying to determine to assist them if someone has a disability and ensure that they're not being discriminated against. Like we're thinking about, can I see this disability or is it invisible? So we can't see every disability. Some of the ones that are more observable that we see, of course, are blindness or deafness or hard of hearing, mobility limitations, other impairments, sometimes intellectual impairments. So sometimes we can recognize types of autism when we see it, different neurological things like Parkinson's disease. We can see maybe if someone has that. Also sometimes we can see if someone has mental health, has mental illness. But often I think with mental illness especially, these are less observable, right? And also with substance use disorders, we don't necessarily see the first time we meet someone whether they have one of these impairments or disabilities. Also with physical impairments, when we think of we can't look at someone and always know that they have something like cancer or heart disease. And for those of you who don't remember the days when we could look at someone and know that they had HIV or AIDS, today we don't know when we look at someone whether they have HIV. The last part of this definition I just wanted to talk about was a major life activity. So the definition says that, this disability limits one or more major life activities. So what does that mean? So these are the activities that are important for someone's daily life. So these are really major life things that we do every day that maybe sometimes we take for granted. It's like walking, speaking, hearing, seeing, working, learning, doing just manual tasks and general care for oneself. But there's a lot of, and that's just a really short list that I gave you. There's a lot of things that aren't on this list. Included under major life activities is really your physical and how your bodily activities, like how your immune system is working, how your brain is functioning, basically anything on how to keep your body working. So these are all things that we need that are kind of inherent in that definition. And when we're helping someone or determining disability, there are things that we need to think about. If you go on to the next slide. So again, we wanted to just put some things out there about what discrimination looks like. Some of you may have encountered these things when you're assisting folks. We've seen or heard that as a staff person tries to house a person in a wheelchair with a walker in a building that just isn't accessible. There's no ramp to enter the building doesn't have an elevator, and their unit is on the 3rd floor and they can't physically with their walker walk up those number of stairs. So we see sometimes that people are returned to the coordinated entry system because they say they can't find an appropriate or accessible unit. With shelters, some shelters that are congregate, they use bunk beds. And so if on that night, all of the bunk beds are on the top bunk, they deny folks from staying in the shelter that night. Discrimination also goes into language and interpretation. So are you able to provide, or can ASL be provided to someone at intake so they understand the process of enrollment? Again, this one that we had before, the staff person refuses to enroll someone because they feel like they might make somebody uncomfortable. Often we hear this with, or sometimes we hear this with folks with mental illness because their mental illness might be so apparent that it may make people uncomfortable. This is a very problematic form of discrimination. Disclosure again, disclosing someone's disability. Some places have, like for HIV, they actually, there's a fine for disclosing someone's status. So we, find that intentionally or inadvertently people are disclosing people's disabilities. And then this one I feel is unfortunately very common. Landlords asking lots of questions about a prospective tenant that are inappropriate and about their disability. I think that any of these examples really that discrimination is compounded when we factor in multiple factors such as race, national origin, gender, gender identity. Going back to the ASL example, if you're doing compounding that with national origin, if a person is not an American by origin, maybe they may need a different type. Their first language isn't English. They may need a different type of interpretation than American Sign Language, because there are different types in the world. I'm just going to close out this section with why this matters. Again, we found some kind of frightening statistics or data points. So disability discrimination complaints were 60%, 62% of all fair housing complaints. Again, with this intersectionality piece, 17% of all complaints were disability discrimination plus another bias. So that could be race, that could be national origin, that could be gender identity, like any one of those, any other one is included. There was a really interesting study about housing discrimination with people who have hearing impairments. I think this data point is particularly striking. 40% of rental firms hung up on a deaf or hard of hearing individual at least once during the interaction. So I think of this of we're helping the hardest to house, and if they're trying to find their own units, like there's blatant discrimination that can happen just over the phones. They don't even get the opportunity to know if there are opportunities for them to access a unit in the community. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris now.
Great, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Abby. I think it's so helpful for kind of your framing of why we're here and kind of looking at all of the different examples of how discrimination can manifest itself and be experienced either with intention or without, kind of in all different ways that we operate our program. We're going to take a few minutes here to step back and think and talk a little bit more about the fair housing laws that guide and give us kind of the structure in which we are able to promote fair housing, and would like to begin it with just a quick video clip in talking about why fair housing matters and why we're all here to make sure we're all level set.
On April 11th, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968.
Now with this bill, the voice of justice speaks again.
The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in housing because of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status.
Fair housing for all human beings, is now a part of the American way of life.
When I was looking for a house, 1959, somewhere in there, the people who show houses were not showing houses on a non-discriminatory basis. I'd see the same houses over and over again, and I wanted to see what was advertised outside of the integrated or the minority community. I was getting tired, and we needed to get the children in school. And one day in September, I went out with a fair housing person and bought a house after having looked for months. And I volunteered and stayed with the Fair Housing Council ever since. Been a long haul. Our ultimate goal is to go out of business. We'll go out of business when equal opportunity in housing becomes a reality.
There's a line from one of my favorite prayer books that says, "Moment by moment we choose, and if we choose rightly and often enough, we can restore the broken fragments of our world to wholeness." Discrimination fragments. It breaks things up. It wrecks lives. it prevents progress. Fair housing opens the door to all sorts of other areas of fairness.
I mean, housing to me is the center of everything. Housing is the center of building wealth. The studies right now show that children who have security in housing will develop better, will do better in school, once you know you have a home to go to.
Great, thank you, Erin. To me, in thinking about that and thinking about why are we here, is the quote from the prayer book, which, just to paraphrase again, is that, moment by moment, we are choosing, and if we choose right enough, we will improve housing opportunities. We will improve access for the people that we're trying to serve, and that is our goal here, and that is really the goal of this whole training series is to think about how we can, choose right and improve access for all participants who are in need of assistance through the ESG program. You can go to the next slide. And I think when we talk about fair housing laws, I think we so often talk about, well, what are the requirements? What do we need to do? What do we need to make sure that we're doing? But in thinking about fair housing, I think it's really important to start by saying, our goal is not just to be following what are the requirements. The certification that we all agree to in being funded with HUD dollars is that we are agreeing to affirmatively further fair housing. That we will be affirmatively marketing and promoting housing opportunities, proactively combating segregation and discrimination, making sure that we are providing information in a way that is accessible and attainable to all potential participants. And then when we see something that is wrong, or a condition or another issue that may impact access to fair housing or fair housing choice, that we are escalating that. Abby and Karen did a great job in talking through so many different ways that we see different types of discrimination. I want to just take a minute here for everybody on the line to reflect and think about your programs that you operate day in and day out, and share in the chat. If you want to share on the line, you can raise your hand and we'll make sure to unmute you. But share not just, how are you complying with fair housing, but how are you affirmatively furthering fair housing? What steps are you taking in your intake? What steps are you taking in how you are thinking about where you're placing people into permanent housing? Are you looking at access to schools, access to transportation? And what are ways that you are taking your program from an affirmative fair housing perspective? As you all are typing, I'm going to share an example that I was able to start with the city that I'm working with a couple years ago. Is I think we all, or many of us, are familiar with rent reasonableness tests and how we go through the checklist of rent reasonableness. And in looking at that checklist, I realized, yes, we were checking off how many bedrooms and is that reasonable, and how many bathrooms, what is the parking access, and all physical descriptions of the space. But we weren't thinking about what is the environment that housing unit is located, which is so important, right? And on the video, the last speaker talked about what is that we need to have access to healthcare, we need to have access to schools, we need to have access to jobs, to transportation, to really be addressing fair housing. And so working to put all of those into how we were evaluating rent reasonableness and not just looking at the physical components of the unit, but instead evaluating that this unit might be a little bit more expensive, but it's 2 blocks away from the community center or a block away from transit. And Erin, it looked like you had an example.
Yeah, something that I just started doing recently, actually. I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, and we have a local fair housing advocacy organization that's mostly staffed with attorneys, kind of like a legal aid, but they do a lot of different work on trying to address discrimination in our local housing market. And so they have a program that's kind of like a secret shopper, but a secret renter shopper. And so I will get assigned a fake background of certain characteristics, and I will go to rental or leasing offices and kind of share my little cover story with certain details and see, what kind of information they do or do not give back to me depending on certain key points. So like I might say that I have a very old cat, or if I'm calling that I have a wheelchair to be considered, or that maybe I don't make 3 times the rent and income. And it's been really neat and interesting. And they actually just had an article about a property management company that's in multiple states across the country that was definitely doing racial discrimination in their application process. So it's been pretty cool to be a part of that. So I say, if you're looking to get more involved, maybe check and see if you have any local like fair housing or tenant associations that would allow you to kind of be part of that work and contribute to it.
Thank you, Erin. And what a great opportunity too then for education, with the property management companies or the landlords or the property owners, where I think unfortunately we often see some of these biases are intentional, others are not intentional. And I think it can be a great learning opportunity of how other folks can continue to improve to provide more inclusive housing. Nancy shared a couple of great examples in the chat, making sure that providing transportation translations. And Nancy, I really like this, that making you're clarifying and ensuring that you're providing time to listen, which I think is so important, of making sure that you're giving space and not trying to move people through your intake or engagement process quickly. Providing advocacy, educational opportunities, access to bathrooms, and making sure all those services are available for clients. Next slide. So we're going to talk quickly about the primary fair housing laws and authorities that govern the ESG and ESG CV program. And we'll begin with the Federal Fair Housing Act. Next slide. The Federal Fair Housing Act, this was touched on the video, but this is an act that protects people from discrimination, when renting or buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in other housing related activity. And I think that other housing related activity is so important, as that I think touches on just about everything that we do, that we are touching kind of within that, and making sure that there are protections to protect people from discrimination and in those life cycle of programs. The next act, if we can go to the next slide, or the next law. Oh, sorry. We kind of touched on this a little bit as we were going, but of kind of thinking about what are the types of housing discrimination that we may see, providing false or misleading information, right? As Erin described her experience, steering members of a protected class to one neighborhood or to a specific area, and then how properties are advertised, but also how programs are advertised, how we're doing outreach. If you are operating an emergency shelter, how you are advertising who that shelter is serving, and making sure that that advertisement is being an inclusive document. Next slide. And we've touched on our protected classes already. Abby and Karen kind of talked through many of these. I do want to highlight that within California, we have 5 additional protected classes above those within the federal categories. So being immigration status, genetic information, marital status, source of income, and veteran status. Next slide. Our next fair housing law and authority is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this is both ensuring that there is not discrimination. Discrimination won't happen based upon disability, but also ensuring that both reasonable accommodations and modifications can be made to your program, to the housing unit, to support and to enable an individual to fully experience and live within that housing unit or within that space. We'll continue to go through these quickly. The next two, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, more broadly, prohibits discrimination on the basis of protected classes in any program that's receiving federal funds or other federal assistance. And as we can talk about the Civil Rights Act, also just want to highlight that Title VII, which is focused on employment discrimination. In 2020, there was a Supreme Court case, Bostock versus Clayton County, which identified that there cannot be, that discrimination is illegal related to sexual orientation and gender identity by associating those and tying those to sex. And so including identity and orientation under the category of sex within the Civil Rights Act under Title VII. That hasn't been fully applied to Title VI within court, but I think that did provide quite a bit of legal backing within the Civil Rights Act. HUD Equal Access Rule, we will be spending a lot of time over the next month continuing to talk about this, but that serving participants regardless of sexual orientation, identity, composition, or marital status. And I think most importantly that it is the participants who are fully defining themselves for program participation, and the participants are only the ones who can be defining themselves. Next slide. And then within California, 2 acts to just touch on very quickly. The Unruh Civil Rights Act, prohibiting discrimination by all business establishments, and this includes any housing or public entity. So all of our activities are falling under that. And then the California Fair Employment Housing Act, prohibiting discrimination in a very similar fashion to the federal law in protecting classes for housing and employment cases. And so I think, again, want to just take a minute and hear from you all. We pause to hear examples of affirmatively furthering fair housing. You all shared in the poll earlier of what are the most common types of discrimination that you see, but would love to hear some more particulars about it and can talk through some of those issues, some of those challenges of discrimination that you experience. So I think if folks would like to either type into the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can share out loud of what are the types of discrimination that you are seeing right now within your housing and homeless service programs, and kind of what or how are you working to address those? And we'll give folks a minute to think about that and type some of their ideas into the chat. And as you all are typing, I'm going to go ahead and share kind of an example that I've been thinking about this. I was talking with Abby and Karen about this a little bit yesterday of seeing so much inadvertent and potentially intentional kind of discrimination in how programs are messaged. Seeing shelters described as a women and children shelter, but then within its program guidelines indicating that it's available and open to serve all. But just that messaging in and of itself can be a deterrent for people to be accessing or potentially kind of accessing and engaging kind of services within that shelter. Yeah, Abby, you're talking about kind of mobility issues, especially services are provided in older facilities.
Yeah, and people not really understanding that that is discriminating. So, if it's like in a basement and there's no way to get down the steps in a wheelchair or a walker or, a lot of different mobility situations. And it's sort of a, well, this is what we have, rather than, oh, this is something that we need to correct for. I've seen that a lot.
Nancy, you share, both of concerns with mental health and that being an impediment that's scaring people, potentially both those kind of working within the space as well as other program participants, and creating a fear of exclusion and gender assigned bathrooms. Any other thoughts before we kind of move on to Karen to talk through more of the life cycle of this work? And we will have Veronica, absolutely. Child nursing areas being just placed in the women's restroom, either not having a neutral bathroom space or in all bathrooms. Holly, you share from an event from the autism LGBTQ intersection of challenges of getting into affordable housing. And I think that really resonates with what Abby was talking earlier about the intersectionalities, that when we start seeing kind of multiple protected classes falling into one person or one individual, of how challenging access to housing and access to services can be for that individual. And I think as we switch over to Karen, I think these ideas, these questions that you have, kind of issues that you're seeing, we can continue to help workshop and kind of brainstorm what are strategies, what are ways to address and rectify. And I think, to me, most importantly, affirmatively further fair housing and your programming. So you're not just checking the box that you did something to address it, but you're actually doing it in a way that makes housing access even better. We will continue to do that through all of our trainings and workshops. And with that, Karen, I will turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so Chris gave a great segue into this next part. We really wanted to end with some kind of real world thoughts and applications for these rules and laws, and how you can think about how either they're currently part of your programs or your system, or how you could do it better moving forward if you're doing something new. So I think we need to go forward a couple of slides and pause on our. So, do we have a poll, Abby, that we missed? Did we need to go back? Sorry, I didn't realize.
We do, but you know what? These things are all flexible. So I think with the time, maybe let's just go forward. And if we have time, we can come back and do the poll.
Okay. Okay. So we can go one more forward. So we wanted to look at these kind of applications, or evaluating how have implemented or applied these laws and rules in two ways. We want to first look at kind of the program the design aspect, how this content is embedded in that. This slide is meant to be general, so it could apply to whether it's a shelter or a permanent housing design or creation. I would also say that this could kind of be program design / quality improvement. So I think if you're doing quality improvement, I think you might go through a similar cycle of aspects where you might look at and say, are we doing the things that we need to do regarding these different laws and rules and regulations. So just starting at the top, like when we're thinking about program design or project design, if we're building something, we're creating a new housing structure, in that design, we're thinking about the compliance with ADA. We're thinking about how are people able to enter the building. To Abby's point, lots of old buildings aren't accessible to folks. So the building itself, are the units themselves accessible? Are the bathrooms, the sensory issues that someone mentioned, are those being accounted for? Simple things like, are the countertops at a height that someone at a wheelchair could use them, or are the cabinets at a height that they could reach them? So things like that when you're doing your initial design. And then we move kind of over into, once you're getting ready to house folks or have folks in this particular location, the management of that building. Sometimes we have a property management part of our own agency, or we contract that out with someone, or we're doing work where we're leasing spaces from private landlords. So, so who are these folks that you're going to be working with, and how do you determine if they have an understanding for fair housing and non-discrimination? Like, how do you assess their knowledge and their understanding to comply with those things? If they don't, like, how are you going to convey that to them? How are you going to educate them on those aspects, these aspects that we talked about today? Part of this planning for these interactions is like really thinking that through. What if I do engage with a landlord and they clearly don't have an understanding of what fair housing is? With that, there could have been like a little dotted line to the left to the staff training and service delivery. Like, how do we ensure that the staff are trained and comfortable with, conveying these ideas and educating folks, especially with relationships that are kind of outside your organization. So folks that aren't really embedded in this work and really understand the need and the purpose of it. Moving on, when we're designing our services, we want our services to be in alignment with fair housing and be non-discriminatory. So how are you going to ensure that your services are welcoming, equitable, accessible, I would say non-judgmental, another aspect that we want, people want to and can engage in them. So a couple of things we kind of already touched on, like how are you ensuring that translation is available, whether that's language translation or for those who may have a hearing impairment. If you have folks who are homebound, how are you going to ensure that they receive services? I mean, some of these things we've better worked out because of COVID having to go virtual. But I think even when we do something new, we have to think of how that could happen, and because folks have lots of different needs, and how can we make sure that these services we're providing adhere to the kind of the rules, but also make people want to engage with them. I think policy and procedure development, this might be the easiest for some of you on the workshop. Like, we need to actually write them down, many aspects of fair housing, equal access, and non-discrimination. Often projects really do talk, and they're verbally, they're saying of all these things, but then when we look at their policies and procedures, they haven't actually written it down to a place where that's tangible, that someone, especially the people they're working with, could go and see what their policies are related to these and read them for themselves and know that they're codified in the organization. So, and the last one, I think sometimes maybe equally challenging as the other. So we've embedded fair housing, non-discrimination in the planning and the development of our physical locations and the services and the policy. But we need our team, our people who are doing the work day to day to carry this forward. So how are you creating and supporting your staff to embody, these values and these and what's in these rules and laws, and ensuring that's consistent, that everyone feels welcome and they have equitable access to services. Again, I think if you're thinking about your project or program that's already up and running, you could do a similar review to any of these aspects of how is our building still accessible? Do we need to change something? Are the landlords we're working with understanding of these things? So, and then I think one part of this too is really engaging people from who are in our programs or who have completed them and how we're doing on these things. So getting some real current information of whether our whole program is welcoming and accessible and equitable from their perspective. You can go on to the next one. So we really wanted to finish with the people, I would say, and the people, should probably say people experience and not necessarily participant experience, because I think it's really important to not only, it's so easy for us when we're at the level of administering and creating these projects to just think of that, the rules and the laws themselves, and we lose sight of what the actual person experience is with a lot of this. And so we wanted to look at this from when someone enters into our programs until when they leave, and how fair housing, non-discrimination, gender equity, and equal access are embedded throughout their experience in our project. So I mean, we put some questions in here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but when we're I'm going to highlight a few, especially some that may have more intersectionality to it. With intake and enrollment, there's access issues. I think the part about families staying together, so this could overlap in different ways. It could be, again, with how we look at families and familial status. We can look at how we look at gender identity. Can my family stay together? If not, I mean, maybe they will choose not to engage in that project. I think with service delivery, a lot of these are about how people are treated, how the services are offered to them. Do the same rules apply to everyone? So I think that's when we are administering projects. Sometimes we hear that folks don't feel that this person has different rules than I do, and so that discrimination can take on lots of different that discrimination can be in lots of different aspects that are interconnected. It could be because of their race, it could be because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation, and their disability, right? So we're compounding how the rules may be different for different people. One, I think just a simple one is am I allowed to practice my religion? I think sometimes when we look deep into our service delivery, we sometimes offer or have things available at times when people need to go out and worship or go to their place of worship. And so are we really cognizant of those aspects of that? With complaints, I think this is another part where sometimes where we see we should question whether the equity and the fairness of what we're doing. like the one about what if someone talks about me without my permission? So that could be another participant. It could be a staff member. How are we having policies and processes in place that can address that? I think the other one, what if I have a problem and no one understands me? So this could be another point of like intersectionality. It could be, based on national origin or cultural aspects. It could be based on language. It could also be based on how that person is perceived by others or feel that they're being perceived by others in the program, in the project based on their gender, or the staff based on their gender or their sexual orientation. And an exit, we just have a couple in here about, do I understand why I'm asked to leave? Like sometimes people are asked to leave and they don't really understand the reasons. And so we need to make sure that people understand clearly why they've been asked to leave and ensuring that they're not being discriminated against for any of the reasons that we've talked about. The one that I didn't add that I think I thought of after we did this slide, I think is important too, is like, does anyone care about my experience in this project, right? And so when we're thinking about people's experiences and improving our programs, like we need to like hear from them about what their experience actually was, whether they felt like they had been treated equitably and fairly, and that they were welcomed into this project and gotten all the resources they needed, and they didn't experience any discrimination that they just didn't say, because we know that lots of folks feel that they've been discriminated against or have like microaggressions towards them, and they never say anything, right? And so we want to make sure that there's a forum or a place for them to have a voice, right? To the initial slide that Abby said, that there's a sense of belonging that people can say when things weren't as what they expected, or that they felt that things could be better. And that's all that I have. So Abby, I'm going to turn it back over to you, I think.
Thank you. Kristen, can you go to the next slide? Or Erin, sorry, I'm not sure who's driving what. And can we take the slides down? We have about 10 minutes that we can do some Q&A. We have 3 questions that were asked, but I would also encourage everybody to type in questions or come off of mute and turn on your cameras. I feel so lonely here. So while you're doing that, Chris, I think there's a question that came in that I'd like see if you want to respond. Says Abby gave an example that you can't ask about sickle cell anemia because it associates with a protected class. Does that mean we shouldn't ask any detailed questions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Abby, and I think can create a lot of anxiety, for people in the intake process, to make sure that you're not kind of inadvertently asking something. And I think what I would recommend, you absolutely can ask detailed questions. I think it is something where you want to have, the questions that you want to ask that are part of your intake process already established. And I think with each question, look at that question and say, well, if somebody answered one way or another, is that directing them or implying that they are a part of a protected class, and is that swaying in any way kind of how the housing decision is being made? If it's a single individual kind of asking, well, do you need someone else to help afford the rent, is not a question that would be appropriate to be asking. That's not your assumption to be making in the interview. To be making kind of assumptions on kind of orientation or identity, in a shelter is not your place to be making, right? I think we've talked, all 3 of us, I think have talked about the fact that gender identity is something for the participant alone to be defining and being something that you would be following. So I think, you can ask questions. I think though it becomes really important to make sure that what you're asking, that you're fact checking with yourself or with colleagues first. And I think there's some great kind of examples of what are steering questions that you might not have thought of as steering questions. And I think there are some tools that I'll try to pull up and put into the chat now. And if not, we'll have it in a link of resources. I think we'll be keeping kind of a running set of resources for everyone that will just get bigger and bigger through every training. And we'll make sure to put that in.
Thanks, Chris. One came in that I will respond to. I think Julia asked, can you go into why the history of incarceration isn't a protected class? So I'm going to give an unsatisfying response, but then I will give something more satisfying, I promise. It is not a protected class. And I don't actually know why, other than I would say at the time that the civil rights laws were enacted, this is not a group of folks that were flagged as having disproportionate impacts of, any number of harms against them. However, in recent years, HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity has issued guidance on this. And I think it's not super well known, in part because it came out towards the end of 2015. There were some other things in 2016. The Trump administration came in, things got de-emphasized. However, the nice thing about guidance is it remains in effect until it's not. Until something supersedes it. So I want to put the link to the directed guidance in here in the chat for you. And like Chris said, we are going to make sure you have all of this. But I also want to put in here a second link, which is all of the fair housing policy statements that are currently in effect. They're organized by protected class, so it's really easy to go through. You can see when they were published, they give full titles. I say this and am highlighting it because the Fair Housing website has not always been this easy to navigate. So you really can find things there. But the first document that I popped up in the chat is in regards to the use of criminal records by housing providers. And when it's okay and when it's not. Now, this is highly applicable to our field because I know that we have many people coming through the system with criminal records, and that presents a barrier. We have housing authorities that make blanket statements. We have housing providers, on the private side that make blanket statements. And it's not as simple as that. As this guidance from April 2016 tells us. So I think that's a very positive, it was a very positive move. I was cheering when this came out. And I would encourage you to read it and use the information in it. I think that there is a lot of education that still needs to be done about this, about the fact that this policy statement exists, that this guidance exists. So it's not going to be, I don't think it's like, that you can become the fair housing police overnight and say, no, but see, it says right here. But I think it's a beginning, and that they will, I think the Fair Housing Office is going to continue to educate, but I also think that you all in your communities can play a role in that education. Knowing that, doing the dance with landlords is always nuanced. And then Karen, there's a third question that came in. So what about programs that do not allow kids of certain ages? So if there's like at 13, you're out, especially, or, at 13, if you're a boy, once you hit 13, you're out. What does that mean in terms of familial status? And does it matter if there's government funding or not? Oh, you're muted.
Just gonna talk and try to fumble through that, my response on mute. That's always the question, like, does it matter if there's government funding or not? I'm just gonna give my take, and I'm having Chris jump in if you want to too. so in some ways government funding gives like the structure and how we can kind of like hold people accountable if they're doing these things and we don't like them. I think like it matters from, I think, a moral and human perspective of like, is our system, right? Like let's just put on our system hats for those of you who are system leads too. Like we want our system to be welcoming and equitable and affirming for people and children, especially regardless of their age. And I think that, you know, if there is a project, and we do see this, that there are shelters who receive no federal funding at all. And so they, you know, they don't feel they have to follow these rules. I think in California, you have some other laws that they may be accountable for, whether they receive funding or not, just from a discrimination point. But like, I mean, we want to move our system so that it is equitable and they are taking children of these ages. I think, you know, the other part of it is if these kids who are 13 to 17 aren't allowed to be in a shelter, where are they going? Are they going to someplace safe? We see high rates of young people who've experienced homelessness as children to experience it as adults, and we want to stop that. So I think, you know, this is a point where we want to bring, you know, the system together to talk through how could this program start accommodating, you know, male children, especially from 13 to 17. What do we need to do regarding training or changing your policies or changing the perception of that? Because we know there's significant ramifications based on education and future experience of homelessness with this. So I hate when we just put it in the little box of is it funded or is it not? It's really a human question of we want to treat people with decency and make sure that they're sheltered if they need it.
I think the one thing I'd add to that is that the way the Fair Housing Act is set up, shelter sits in a funky place with that rule. Sometimes it qualifies as a residential environment and sometimes it doesn't. The HUD's Fair Housing Office has been pretty clear about the fact that they are not going to lay out any hard and fast rule of this shelter is and this shelter isn't. They apply a multi-factor analysis each time. My general, you know, going advice to people is, you know, get out of the danger zone. If you are worried about violating the Fair Housing Act and you don't know if you are a resident or not, you're not going to know until you are fielding a complaint or a violation complaint, which is not a situation anybody wants to be in. That's my bad cop response. But I think, Karen, you're giving I think this is a moral imperative. We can't be turning children away. I appreciate that. So can you pull the slides back up? I want to briefly touch on our next session. And as my wonderful colleagues have said throughout, please put into the chat what you want more of going forward. We are going to ask this again next week. But just to go over what we have coming up. So next week, same time, same place, we will be digging into the LGBTQIA2S+ umbrella. We will be talking about the equal access rule. It will be a lot of gender, a lot of sexual orientation training. And then also I've just included on here, though there are several weeks out, but these 2 tracks that we have, one for the frontline staff and one for directors and supervisors, however you want to fall into that. We have our first frontline staff workshop on July 13th, putting anti-discrimination policies into practice. And then we have our first supervisor director workshop about incorporating underrepresented perspectives into your programs. Again, tell us in the chat what you want to see. We are going to keep asking that question as we go. And with that, I will turn it back to Chris with a thank you for attending.
Thank you, Abby and Chris Andrews and Karen as well for that fantastic session today. Hopefully we'll see many of you next week. And thank you all for attending this California Housing Community Development Community Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on the next community workshop series sessions. We are picking up some steam. A really quick three-question survey will pop up as the session ends. Please provide your feedback there as well, so we can ensure these training sessions are as useful as possible.